Okay, now we're going to begin talking about federalism. There are two basic types of federalism that we need to talk about. The first one is going to be called horizontal federalism. Horizontal federalism reflects the division of power between a national government and regional governments. In the United States, there's two basic models of horizontal federalism. The first one is called layer cake or dual federalism. Under layer cake or dual federalism, the division of power between the national government and the regional governments, which we call in the United States, we call them states, is rather strict. A function of government is either national or it is state. There is basically no overlap. Another model of federalism is marble cake or cooperative federalism. Marble cake federalism or cooperative federalism holds that some functions of government are national, some functions of government are state, but many functions of government are mixed in between, hence the analogy of the marble cake. For example, under layer cake federalism, public education is a function of states. Under marble cake federalism, it is a function of both the national government and the state. While constitutionally public education is a reserved power of the states, the national government interjects itself into public education through the issuance of grants. Because the national government gives money to states for educational purposes, the national government can set the terms for the receipt of that money, and thus they begin to set education policy. So they're in effect making policy in an area that they would not otherwise be able to. Another type of federalism in the United States is what is known as vertical federalism. Vertical federalism is about the relative power, or to me, the relationship of the states amongst themselves. How do the states interact with each other? We'll talk more about that on a later slide. Okay, supremacy clause. The supremacy clause of the Constitution is the portion of the Constitution that declares that the national government and actions of the national government will be superior to that of the states. This, of course, assumes that the national government is acting within its proper sphere of authority. Actions of the national government that exceed its authority obviously do not necessarily impede the states or regulate the states. The national government has to act within its sphere of authority for the supremacy clause to be operational. The supremacy clause is first interpreted in a court case called McCulloch versus Maryland. We talked about McCulloch versus Maryland in the Constitution's lectures. In McCulloch versus Maryland, the Bank of the United States was created by Congress, and some political forces in Maryland had objections to it. So Maryland tried to tax the bank out of existence. Long story short, the dispute is handled by the Supreme Court. There are two basic questions that the Supreme Court has to wrestle with regarding McCulloch versus Maryland. First, can the Congress of the United States create a bank, which means they're going to have to interpret the elastic clause? And then secondly, can Maryland tax the bank? In answer to the first question, yes, the government of the United States can create a bank because of a loose interpretation of the elastic clause. The second question, can Maryland tax the bank? The answer is no, because what the national government does inside of its sphere of authority is superior to that of the states. The court holds that the power to tax implies the power to destroy, and since Maryland cannot destroy, impede, or otherwise interfere with a proper action of the national government, it logically follows that Maryland cannot tax the Bank of the United States. Another area in which the supremacy clause is in operation is a concept called preemption. There is a sphere of type of power or a sphere of policy making where there's an overlap between the national government and the states. For example, commerce. While the national government has the ability to regulate interstate commerce, states have the ability to regulate intrastate commerce. That is to say, commerce that is wholly inside of the state. Well, most commerce is actually probably best described as a little of both. So in some areas, the national government can make a decision that will preempt or override state decision making. We're not going to get too much into it. For purposes of this course, if you simply understand what that term means, you'll be okay. Fiscal relationships between the national government and the states. The national government of the United States gives states money and then has the authority to tell them how to do it. So how does the national government give the states money? There are three basic ways in which the national government does this. The first of which is through a process known as categorical grants. These are also called categorical grants in aid or grants in aid. With a categorical grant, the national government creates a program and funds it, and states or local governments write applications to participate in the program and then are able to administer the program under the rules set forth by the national government. Categorical grants do not provide states very much flexibility, if any at all. If a state runs a categorical grant program, it will do so more or less exactly the way the national government says. This can be contrasted with what are called block grants. A block grant is a grant for a general purpose and allows states and local governments a much wider degree of freedom. States and local governments obviously prefer block grants, whereas special interest groups who lobbied Congress for the creation of a grant program prefer categorical grants. Another way in which money is transferred from the national government to the states is through a process called revenue sharing. Revenue sharing essentially was free money that the national government gave to the states with virtually no strings attached to it. Revenue sharing, however, ended in the 1980s and as such is not that relevant to our discussion today. Because the national government gives states money, and because the Constitution in certain instances authorizes it to, the national government can mandate certain policies and certain behaviors from states. Some mandates are based on grants. The national government, because it gives money to states, can say this is what you're going to do with the money, this is how you're going to spend it, and if you take the money you have to do this or you can't do that. These are called mandates, and these mandates in this instance are based upon participation in a grant program. Some mandates in this area can be considered funded or unfunded. The national government could change a program and say, if you're going to participate in the program, we will fund it, but you will do more than what you might have been required to do in the past, and we will not give you any additional money. Obviously, states are free to participate or to not participate, at least legally, they're free to participate or not participate. However, politically, their hands are tied. Once a program is put in place, the people who receive the benefits of that program expect that it will be continued. So states are rather reluctant to discontinue participation in a grant program. So in those instances, these unfunded mandates can produce somewhat of a burden on states. Some mandates are funded. Federal government could change a grant program and say, well, there's new requirements, we will go ahead and pay the full price of those. And that obviously would be called a funded mandate. Some mandates are not tied to grants at all. The national government, in a few instances, has the ability to compel a certain behavior from states. For example, segregation in public schools. The national government, in the court case Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, mandated that states will not run segregated school systems. This was not tied to any sort of grant participation, and if states did not comply, they were under threat of direct federal intervention, and that's exactly what happened in Little Rock. So some mandates are tied to grants, meaning it could be a condition of funding, and some mandates issued by the national government in no way are tied to grants. You will comply because the national government has the authority to make the policy decision. Some funding from the national government could be characterized as matching funds, meaning for participation in let's say a block grant program or a categorical grant program, the national government would not fully fund it, but would require states to pay a certain portion of the program. This could be a dollar-for-dollar matching program, or some other ratio could be involved. The downside to a matching funds program is that if a state were to cut its budget, that could dramatically impact the state's revenue, because for every dollar they took out of a matching funds program could actually result in a $2 decline, because the national government would not contribute its portion of the money as well. Power of the national government of the United States has tended to expand exponentially from the founding of the government under the Constitution to the present day. While this has been an uneven growth, the overall trend has been for growth in national power. This has occurred several ways. First off is a loose interpretation of the elastic clause, also known as the necessary and proper clause. Obviously, depending upon how you define what is necessary and proper, this can cause a growth or a contraction in the elastic powers of the national government. The loose interpretation of the elastic clause begins, as previously noted, with the court case of McCulloch versus Maryland. Another way the power of the national government has grown over the last 200 years has been with interpretations of the Commerce Clause and also the growth of interstate commerce. Beginning with the court case of Gibbons versus Ogden, the Supreme Court has held that interstate commerce will be broadly defined. This definition, the definition of interstate commerce today, functionally is any commerce that is directly or indirectly affected by or affects something in another state would be considered interstate commerce. Therefore, for all intents and purposes, all business activity is considered interstate commerce. There are incredibly technical exceptions to this, but they're not worthy of mention. Again, basically, all commerce is interstate commerce, which means the national government has the power to regulate virtually all business activities. Fiscal federalism. This is the process by which the national government gives states grants and then tells them what to do with the money. This allows the national government to enter into policy-making areas that would otherwise be unable to do so. Previously, I mentioned the example of education. Education is a reserved power of the states. The national government has no authority to enter into education policymaking. However, since the national government gives states money, it can put conditions on the receipt of that money and therefore can require states to comply with certain educational rules. The 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution was passed after the Civil War. It contains several clauses. Two that are most important for this course will be the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause. The Due Process Clause, in the case of Gitlow versus New York, will be used to begin the process of selective incorporation. Selective incorporation is the process of applying parts of the Bill of Rights to the states on a case-by-case basis. This has increased the power of the national government because now the national government has the authority to determine the minimum protection that states will give their citizens. Prior to selective incorporation, states relied upon their own Bill of Rights to determine the minimum level of protection for civil liberties. After selective incorporation, the minimum level of protection is now set by the national constitution interpreted by the Supreme Court, and the maximum level of protection in a state is set by its state constitution and its accompanying Bill of Rights. The other part of the 14th Amendment that is tended to increase power of the national government is the Equal Protection Clause. The Equal Protection Clause requires that states treat citizens equally if they are members of a suspect classification. For purposes of this course, there are two suspect classifications, those being race and sex. States cannot discriminate based upon membership in the suspect classification unless they can show a compelling government interest. For all practical purposes, it is virtually impossible to show a compelling government interest. Therefore, states cannot discriminate based upon race and sex. Exceptions to this and what these compelling government interests would be, we'll discuss whenever we talk about civil rights. Aside from suspect classifications, states can basically discriminate upon other criteria without intervention of the federal government.